he also estimated that the same kind of internal repression in Maoist China cost 100 million lives. And so you can imagine that the genuine historical figures, again, are subject to dispute, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. And one of the things that's really surprising to me, and that I think is absolutely reprehensible, is the fact that this is not widespread knowledge among students in the West, any of this. And it's because your education, your historical education, if you started to describe it as appalling, you would barely scratch the surface. These were the most important events of the 20th century, and they're barely covered at all in standard historical curriculum. You know something, I would presume, about World War II and about the terrible situation in Nazi Germany and the death of 6 million gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But my experience with students has been that none of them know anything about what happened as a consequence of the repression of the radical left in the 20th century. And I believe the reason for that is that the communist system had extensive networks of admirers in the West, especially among intellectuals, and still, in fact, does, which is also equally reprehensible. And I believe that one of the consequences of that is that this element of history has been under-examined, and certainly very little attention has been brought to it in the public school curricula. And there's absolutely no excuse for that. It was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. And that's really saying something, because the 20th century was about as bad as it gets. And so, and the fact that these deaths on massive scale occurred, and the fact that we don't know that deep inside our bones is a testament to the absolute rot of the education system.
Segment 4, the theory, of which you have more in this book than I'd expected. Righteous indignation. A lot gets explained here. Marx and Hegel had paved the way for the progressives, who in turn had paved the way for the Frankfurt School, who had then attacked the American way of life by pushing cultural Marxism through critical theory. There's a lot going on there. Very briefly, what's the Frankfurt School, and why should anyone watching this interview care?
The Frankfurt School were emigres from
Germany, Austria.
Germany. It was the equivalent of this, the Hoover Institution. What the Hoover Institution is to Stanford University. The Frankfurt School was a think tank at the University of Frankfurt, and they were social scientists like Herbert Marcuse, Antonio Gramsci, Horkheimer, Adorno. These were all a bunch of guys in the middle of World War II who had suffered in Europe, 2 world wars in a row, and they had been fighting. They had been fighting the Nazis, and they were trying to figure out another aspect of how to how to spread Marxism around the world. You could go to Bolivia, you could go to Bulgaria, and you could go to the peasant class, and you could say, let's flip this place. The Marxist-Stallman argument of getting the workers to get upset at the owners was very easy, but not in America, where the middle class was invested in their productivity, invested in the concept that they could have their own small little American dream, a white picket fence, that they could invent something and go from one generation being dirt poor to being an owner within a very quick period of time. And what these guys figured out when they came to the United States, moved to Santa Monica in the 1940s at the height of the Golden Age. Think about this. These guys left Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy to come to California in the 1940s, and they lived by the beach, and they were depressed by the relentless cheeriness, the productivity, and the capitalism that they witnessed around them. And they came up with at the end of the day, we could call it cultural Marxism, but at the end of the day, we experience it on a day-to-day basis, and by that I mean a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis it's political correctness, and it's multiculturalism. And what it took was this amazing concept of e pluribus unum, where everybody comes here and contributes to this, everybody becomes an American and contributes, but we have a common culture, we have a common border, a common mindset. What they did was take the haves versus have-nots friction and translated it into oppressor versus the oppressed. And
this got taken up by faculties across the country.
That's
the point of the Frankfurt School and the progressivism. It becomes embraced by 60s
post-structuralism
academics.
Post-structuralism, queer studies, African American studies, all of that is pitting people against each other. It is anti-American to its core.
My name is Heather McDonald. I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I've had a long-standing interest in the university because I love universities, but I'm appalled by what's been happening to them recently. College tuition should pay for probably the greatest experience any individual should have, which is to be able to learn, to be able to encounter works of extraordinary beauty and grandeur, wisdom, profundity. This is 4 years to open your mind to what human beings have accomplished, what they overcame. When I was in college in the 70s, I was allowed to study the greatest works of mankind. I was encouraged to read books that would expand my mind into realms I'd never even thought of before. Since then, the poisonous politics of identity have taken over. The biggest problem faced by students today is the encouragement of victimology. Students are taught to look around their environment, which is one of opportunity, and see only hatred and bigotry. Students today are taught, if I'm a female, I should not be expected to read male writers. Or if I'm black, I shouldn't be expected to read white writers. This color coding and gender coding is extraordinarily narrow. There is an entire bureaucracy that is dedicated to the preposterous idea that to be an American student on a college campus is to be the subject of literally life-threatening oppression. UCLA has a vice chancellor for equity, diversity, and inclusion who makes $400,000 a year. The University of California, Berkeley Diversity Division has a budget of about $20 million. They are paying for the growing diversity bureaucracy. And it results in an extreme constriction of what students feel that they want to learn and ought to learn. Most extraordinary language.
It has never been your turn. It's not a debate.
Not only was there no reprimand, the college president gave 2 of those mobsters an award for racial justice. The censorship that is now pervasive on campus has reached into the real world.
A senior software engineer is reportedly out of a job at Google.
What bearing has that got on the influence that intellectuals have over society as a whole?
Because they believe that since knowledge is concentrated in people like themselves, what needs to be done is, in the quote from President Obama, is to put more power in the hands of the experts.
So the intellectual temptation is to say, look, we already know everything.
That's right.
If only we also had
the power,
all the power,
yes,
everything would be just fine.
Yes.
And what's wrong with that view? Why isn't that a sensible view?
One, they don't know everything. They don't know 1/10 of everything. In fact, I argue that they probably don't know 1% of the consequential knowledge in a society.
Consequential knowledge is a concept that runs through this book. Explain that concept.
Knowledge whose presence or absence has consequences, serious consequences. I mean, I was once in a plane that was coming down for a landing in the Ithaca airport, and suddenly the pilot gunned the motor and went up again because someone in the control tower had reminded him that he hadn't lowered his landing gear. So that was consequential knowledge, right? Yes, yes. I was just delighted that that person had his eyes open and his mind on his work.
So the notion here is that the kind of knowledge, the kind of consequential knowledge required to prove effective in governing a nation such as the United States with the biggest economy in the world, 300 million people, you can put together quite a large group of professors, and they're still not going to possess the knowledge that would enable them to run General Motors, for example, or to run the nation's healthcare system, for example.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that has happened all around the world in the 20th century was that all sorts of countries have tried central planning. Now, the guys who run the central planning, they usually have advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. They have mountains of statistics sitting there, and they have all the experts in the country at their beck and call. And yet when you take the power out of their hands and return it to the market, then all the hundreds of millions of people who don't have any of those things usually end up with a higher rate of growth and a more rapid decline in poverty.
Because consequential knowledge by its nature tends to be diffused, widely diffused.
Yes, yes.
Right.
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. They are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself, which they regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting ideologues who claim that all truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists, pushing progressive activism at a college near you. They produce the mobs that violently shut down campus speakers, the language police who enshrine into law use of fabricated gender pronouns, and the deans whose livelihoods depend on madly rooting out discrimination, where little or none exists. Their thinking took hold in Western universities in the 60s and 70s, when the true believers of the radical left became the professors of today. And now we rack up education-related debt, not so that our children learn to think critically, write clearly, or speak properly, but so they can model their mentor's destructive agenda. It's now possible to complete an English degree and never encounter Shakespeare, one of those dead white males whose works underlie our society of oppression. To understand and oppose the postmodernists, the ideas by which they orient themselves must be clearly identified. First is their new unholy trinity of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is defined not by opinion, but by race, ethnicity, or sexual identity. Equity is no longer the laudable goal of equality of opportunity, but the insistence on equality of outcome. And inclusion is the use of identity-based quotas to attain this misconceived state of equity. All the classic rights of the West are to be considered secondary to these new values. Take, for example, freedom of speech, the very pillar of democracy. The postmodernists refuse to believe that people of goodwill can exchange ideas and reach consensus. Their world is instead a Hobbesian nightmare of identity groups warring for power. They don't see ideas that run contrary to their ideology as simply incorrect. They see them as integral to the oppressive system they wish to supplant, and consider it a moral obligation to stifle and constrain their expression. Second is rejection of the free market, of the very idea that free voluntary trading benefits everyone. They won't acknowledge that capitalism has lifted up hundreds of millions of people, so they can, for the first time in history, afford food, shelter, clothing, transportation, even entertainment and travel. Those classified as poor in the US, and increasingly everywhere else, are able to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, in once prosperous Venezuela, until recently the poster child of the campus radicals, the middle class lines up for toilet paper. Third and finally are the politics of identity. Postmodernists don't believe in individuals. You're an exemplar of your race, sex, or sexual preference. You're also either a victim or an oppressor. No wrong can be done by anyone in the former group, and no good by the latter. Such ideas of victimization do nothing but justify the use of power and engender intergroup conflict. All these concepts originated with Karl Marx, the 19th century German philosopher. Marx viewed the world as a gigantic class struggle, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the grasping rich against the desperate poor. But wherever his ideas were put into practice, in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, to name just a few. Whole economies failed, and tens of millions were killed. We fought a decades-long Cold War to stop the spread of those murderous notions. But they're back, in the new guise of identity politics. The corrupt ideas of the postmodern neo-Marxists should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Instead, we underwrite their continuance in the very institutions where the central ideas of the West should be transmitted across the generations. Unless we stop, postmodernism will do to America and the entire Western world what it's already done to its universities. I'm Jordan Peterson, Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto, for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.